Okay, let's jump in. Welcome everyone to another SDEC session. We are basically covering 12 topics for those of you who are new to the SDEC. We are a free community that covers topics related to digital marketing and digital analytics. We're doing, right at this point, weekly webinars. We might have a couple weeks where we do more than one. If you are new to the SDEC and haven't joined a webinar in the past, you can join for free, and I'll be putting the link in the chat of Zoom. The benefit of joining the SDEC officially is that you get notified ahead of time of all of the webinars that we're doing. And you can also be added to our SDEC Slack group where you could see the recordings of all of our past webinars. We now have over 40 past recordings that you can check out. For some reason, we only have 2/3 of the SDEC members who are in the Slack group. So if you're not in the Slack group, I'm going to put my email address in the chat so you can email me, because it takes all of about 5 seconds to join the Slack group. And there you can see job postings, you can see past recordings, and you're one click away from 3,500 of your fellow digital analytics and digital marketing folks. So if you have any questions or technical issues during the session, I will be manning the chat. If you have questions during the presentation for our presenter, Maggie, go ahead and use the Zoom Q&A area. That way we record all the questions, and if there's ones we don't have time to get to, we can get to them in written format. As always, this session will be recorded and will be shared in the Slack group upon its completion later today. So thanks again for joining another SDEC session, and I'd like to hand it off to Maggie.
Thank you so much, Adam, and thank you everybody for joining me today to talk about protecting web analytics implementations. Companies invest a lot of time and effort implementing web analytics in their websites to track marketing and product performance. Unfortunately, the reports delivered are not guaranteed to work forever. Communication breakdowns between people and systems often end up causing reporting failures and blackout periods, especially as the development team starts to grow. In this webinar, we will review the risk and mitigation tactics that web analytics professionals can set in motion to prepare for the worst. My name is Maggie Vega. I am the Marketing Data Ops Principal at Puchixels, and I've got the chance to work a lot with Google and Adobe Analytics over the last 10 years. I've seen all kinds of implementations, and I hope that after today, you will leave with practical tips to save yourself from some of the pains that I've personally had to live through. You can find me in the SDEC and the Measure Slack, and feel free to connect in LinkedIn. All right, so to set the stage, let's just imagine your company has been working on the latest and greatest web property for a few years now, and millions of dollars have been invested in it. Maybe a couple $100,000 just on the analytics implementation alone. And all of the executives have their eyes on the release of their new website and are very excited to see the reports as soon as it launches. So they ask the team to book a room and start sharing some of the reports after the first week. And then something happens. We didn't track the data that the reports were looking for. Oh, wait, we did track some of the data, but no one used our UTMs in their campaign links. Oh, a report is broken. We cannot do anything until the next release in 2 weeks. Does any of these sound familiar? Unfortunately, problems arise because web analytics is often low in the priority list. It just doesn't get the same quality assurance and compliance checks that the rest of the code on the site gets. But it's still code, and it's affecting the entire site and management decisions. This is why I believe analytics should be embedded in every phase and every release of the product development cycle. There are just too many points of failure. The dangers for web analytics are real, and a lot of them require changing the entire mindset around what a web analytics practice actually is. But today, we will focus on the most common technical risks that are easy to find when you're hands-on working away in your day-to-day implementations. The number one risk is changes in the selectors used for tracking. If you need to track a button click and it has an ID or a class you can refer to in the tag manager, it's tempting to use it directly. But these selectors often change when updates and redesigns occur. The industry found this was a problem very quickly and came up with W3 standards suggesting data attributes and global JavaScript objects that are independent of the HTML. In this example, you can see that instead of using the ID learn more in my Google Tag Manager trigger, I created my own data event type and data event name and used that as a selector in the Tag Manager. This separation helps draw the line between what should and should not be changed in the front-end code. Even better are the global JavaScript objects, often referred to as data layers, that you and the developers can use to communicate with each other without touching the HTML at all. In this example, the object called digital data has event info and even validation that we can access without any CSS selectors. And because this is generated in the backend, you can properly account for things like form validation. You may be surprised to see how many sites over-report clicks on buttons that were actually meant for successful form submissions because they're not doing validation and the visitors are forgetting to fill out all of the required fields and basically clicking a lot of times when the form is not actually submitted. In Google Analytics, you will listen for changes in this object instead of changes in the button directly, and you will do that with the custom event triggers. In the future, set dedicated data attributes and objects instead of referring to the raw HTML. Another problem with grabbing whatever the HTML chooses to give you is that it can be an empty string. At the very least, you should have alerts set up for things like page views without a page name or purchases without product names. And you can see here that it's easy to set this up in both Google and Adobe Analytics. Where appropriate, you can even set custom default values to be able to tell the differences between the not provided, not set, unspecified, and so on. Unfortunately, I've seen many websites with 10% or more of the reports filled with nulls that they just thought were normal, but are really due to missing values in certain server calls. So in the future, check for nulls. The second reason for analytics issues are custom code JavaScript errors. The code was working in our environment, so we sent it to production, and then the entire site crashed for half of the visitors because this possibly undefined function didn't exist for all of them. This is particularly bad in those modern React applications where everything runs in JavaScript and can be easily prevented with the classic exception catching best practices that we all know we should be using, but often skip. Conflicting scripts are also pretty common, especially when you have too many simultaneous changes happening on the site. Imagine you're releasing tracking for a new landing page, but somebody else decided to launch an A/B test on that same page, and they have variables that are overriding yours. They may have the same exact script, and nobody told you this was going to happen. Testing against every possible environment and every single time, it's very hard to do manually. But this is where automation tools can help us, and we can use some of the DevOps best practices from our developer friends and bring them into analytics I'm thinking of things like test-driven implementation, functional testing, regression testing. Data true and observe point are two of the tools that are built for these kind of tests. But of course, you can always write your own in Selenium and Python. In the future, use exception catching and integrate analytics with the automated testing that's probably already happened before every release on the website. Third-party script conflicts. You will never think that popular scripts like Hotjar and Facebook will break thousands of sites, until they actually do. It's important to remember that these scripts are dynamically updating on their own schedule. That means there's code that you do not control that's being added to your site. It was only a matter of time for Facebook to break a bunch of websites and for Hotjar to also cause issues in polyfill sites. And the recommendation here is for you to consider storing static versions of the third-party scripts and testing all the updates before they actually go live in your site to make sure there are no conflicts. And the little example that I have here is just the Eloqua script that's specifically tagged for version 200, and it's not going to change to version 300 until I know for sure that my website is ready for it. But these things are pretty hard to predict. They're not that common. So I will recommend you to have a backup ready just in case everything else fails. When my team was first hit by the Hotjar incident, we only knew that the issue was coming from somewhere in the tag manager, but no one had made any changes that day and we didn't really know where to start looking. So the entire container was stripped from the site for a week. Even though we found the problem just a few hours later, there was no way to get another hotfix into production fast enough. So we went for an entire week with zero data. After that, we decided to create a backup container, just like this one I'm suggesting here, that contain only the critical bare-bone tags that we could use for emergency rollbacks to save ourselves some time and be able to troubleshoot without causing issues in production. In the future, opt for script versioning and have a backup container. URLs and page titles are not reliable either. They are often changed for SEO or translation purposes. And yet many sites define their page name reports based on the values of the title HTML tag, for example. So this is really going back to point number 1 on avoiding references to the raw HTML that authors can edit. And if you have seen issues like this, where your page report is actually reporting the same page in different line items and you have different counts for all the metrics, you know that it can be quite time consuming to fix and to basically do analysis and get insights out of these things. What happened here was that the SEO analyst decided to change the title of the homepage from Welcome to SDEC to SDEC Global Webinars, SDEC Best Analytics Webinars, SDEC Welcome. And this can be prevented by defining naming conventions that everybody can agree and are independent of things like the title. So maybe everybody can agree that the page name is just going to be reported as, the homepage is going to be reported as home. And you can still track the title in a separate variable. So you can have the option of showing your reports in both the aggregated view of the actual page and the detailed view with all of the different titles. But at least you will be safe with your page view metrics. The same thing happens with the language and country versions of the same page in a global website. Quite often you end up with 3 different page names and 3 different URLs, but having to report on the performance of the page globally. Again, keeping the page name very specific and even using the same page name in English across all of the different languages and agreeing that that's going to be the standard could get you that aggregated global view. And you can have separate language and country variables if you wanted to do drill downs and filter your report further. This can get very complicated in e-commerce websites when there's hundreds of products and product feeds that are changing the category name every day. So make sure that you're making your metrics and your dimensions as specific as possible. Remember that there are other supporting variables to organize your content as well. So Adobe's hierarchies or Google's content grouping. People often stuff too many things in the page name and in other variables and forget that the more specific they are, the easier they are to troubleshoot. In the future, define naming conventions and content hierarchy reports. Last but not least, we have compliance breaches. And these come in many flavors. So let's start with piggybacking. This screenshot was taken from the DataTrue free tag audit tool, and it shows how many tags can be present in your site without you adding them directly on the source code or through your tag manager. They're like the friends of the friend that you didn't want to invite to the party. And you can find them by just comparing the cookies and the services that are listed in your policy page today, that will be the expectation, versus the network requests that are actually happening on your site. As the person implementing data trackers on the site, I believe it's part of your responsibility to confirm that data collection is properly disclosed to visitors. And of course, you should just always be aware of everything that's happening on your site. But a lot of people don't realize that adding a little thing like a retargeting script can have significant repercussions. But this company, DataTrue, they actually did a study on the top 1,000 sites, and they found that 70% had piggybacking. So I invite you to audit your tags and check your policy pages regularly. PII leaks. This happens when personal identifiable information, PII, is shared with services that were not really supposed to get it. And a very easy way to check if your site has PII leaks today is to just pretend to be visiting the site and fill out a form. In this example in the screenshot, I was pretending to register to an e-commerce site. I typed in my name, I typed my email, I checked the network tools, and sure enough, AdRoll was sharing my email with all of their friends. If you're in extra sensitive industries like healthcare and banking, you should probably interact with every single field, link, and text that contains sensitive data and run a similar test. And don't forget to check for settings that were on out of the box and you may not have touched at all, but are still causing issues potentially in your industry. So things like IP tracking and Adobe Analytics activity map tracking have been known to cause issues in sensitive industries. Finally, make sure that you obey your cookie policy, study your laws, and add all of these compliance checks to your ongoing automated testing. because your cookie banner may be working today, but who knows if it may still be working in the future when you opt out of the cookies. You don't know if it's actually happening until you check. Google and Adobe have a lot of great information on this topic, and the laws have a lot of details, not just related to the collection of the data, but also the storage and how the data needs to be deleted. So yeah, make sure you watch for piggybacking, PII leaks, and cookie policies in the future. Oh, finally, one last thing. We can't talk about cookies without touching on browsing compliance as well. And there's a lot of SDEC webinars on this topic as well. So make sure to check those out, because you will capture more data if you are running first-party cookies as opposed to third-party cookies. And Google is also making a big push toward server-side scripts. So let's just recap what we have just discussed. First, we talk about setting dedicated data attributes and objects to avoid referencing the HTML directly. We set alerts and we started checking for nulls. Second, we use exception catching and we integrated analytics testing into the automated continuous integration cycles that is already happening on the site before every release. Third, we saw that third-party script versioning can save sites, and that it's always good to have a backup container in case everything else fails. Fourth, we defined naming conventions and created custom hierarchies. And finally, we prevented compliance breaches. I know that a lot of these mitigations are a lot of work. So you do need to remember that the cost of reporting shouldn't exceed the value of the insights. And we don't want all of these mitigation practices to slow us down either. I'm also aware that we can't be prepared for everything in the world, but we can make a difference. And we can significantly extend the count of days without accidents when we share and we learn from our failures. In my experience, it's the little things you do to improve on a regular basis that really build up the trust in the web analytics practice, and that eventually add up to create a more data-driven culture in the organization. So next time you have to implement something new, remember you're making a choice, and you should know what it means to take the more difficult path or the less difficult path that maybe save 70% of the time, but it could also kill you 30% of the time. So you just need to be aware of the tolerance for failure that your organization can take. Thank you again for allowing me to share in the Search Discovery Education community today. My name is Maggie Vega. I'm the Marketing Data Ops Principal at Push Excels, and you can find me in Slack and LinkedIn. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maggie. That was great. So anyone who's on the call, if you have questions you want to discuss with Maggie, please, now is a good time to put them in the Zoom Q&A. I see a couple in the chat, so if you can just throw them in the Zoom Q&A so we have them all documented, and we'll start going through them now. So Maggie, the first question we have here is, having a backup GTM container sounds like a good idea. Question I have is, what is the impact on page load speed, if any? And then there's a couple follow-up questions to that, but I'll let you answer that one, and then there's a couple follow-up.
Right, thank you. So to clarify, you're not adding the containers at the same time. You only want to have one. But what the backup does, it was really a variable in the build of the entire site that people could just say load number 1, load number 2. so that if there was an issue with our production container, then they could just change a variable and then the backup container will load instead of the regular one.
Okay, and then the follow-up was, what is the best way to have the backup container? Do you need a new container or workspace for each site, and you just leave the backup container tag off the website?
No, so you don't want to have them at the same time. You do want to replace them and just make it really, really easy to replace them so that even if you're not in the office, the developers can do it. In my case, that meant like adding an environment variable on the whole build of the site. But it's very important for you to talk to your developers, make sure that you are integrating analytics into the QA testing that they already have as much as possible, and work with what works best for them, because they're the ones who are going to be stripping out your container if something goes bad. So yeah, you want to make sure that you communicate with them.
Okay, next one. Lots of good info in here, especially backing up, creating copy of GTM container. Do you have any concerns with integrating GA so much into the website development process and the coupling between GA and the website?
Well, these container implementations should really be agnostic to the platforms that you use. So I may need a little bit more clarification on that question. Sorry.
Okay, well, maybe whoever posted that, if you want to maybe post a little more context as another question, well, we'll keep going. Next one is, one issue I have encountered often with clients is including multiple times the same URL parameter with different values. This usually happens with campaign tracking from copying a URL and adding a new set of campaign parameters. Do you know how Adobe Launch Analytics or GTM and GA handle those situations? How would you adjust your implementation to handle that situation?
So the problem is that like you're looking for a parameter and it's being duplicated.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. But Jose, if you want to respond to that, if we didn't understand the question correctly, but it sounds like they're having the same thing keeps getting copied multiple times, but with different values. But maybe Jose, if you can respond to your question in the Q&A, maybe we'll get some more information and we'll move on. The next one said, can you please share more information on piggybacking?
Yes. So these are tags that are added by a tag. So you didn't add them directly in your source code, and they're not added in your tag manager. But AdRule was a great example because you're just adding a retargeting script, but that retargeting script is adding all of their partners. So it's just important that whenever you add a new tag, you're checking, and I personally like to implement the code on a separate page and see what network requests are it's actually doing, fill out a form, make sure that it's not leaking anything and it's really safe. They all disclaim what they're doing, but they make it very complicated to read all of their terms and conditions. So for me, it's often easier to just check the code and see what's actually doing.
Okay, the next one, could you share some of the best practices to avoid PII data getting set into Google Analytics from the implementation point of view? And someone responded saying that they're in the financial industry and they use hashing scripts to avoid text numeric data, which gets passed to any third-party tags. But any other comments on PII stuff?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And in my experience, this is not the easiest way to troubleshoot, but just going through the site as a visitor and clicking and filling out every form and basically going through every possible scenario that you think a visitor will go through, and recording all of the data that is being sent to all of these different places can help you put a magnifying glass of what was going where and in what format.
Got it.
And sorry, just to expand on that, I know that with the activity map on Adobe Analytics, there's a lot of out-of-the-box tracking that is going to aim to get all of the strings. So even if you have your tag manager encoded, if you still have the default Adobe or Google Analytics functionality and running on the backend that is just grabbing all of the text from all of the links, they're not going to encode it for you. So that's where checking the actual server calls, it's going to help you.
Yeah, and related to that, we had a question that said, does the Adobe Activity Map, is that considered a violation of privacy or compliance?
So it's not bad in itself, but there were a bunch of cases where there was a user profile page. The user profile page had your name in it. It was a link. You go click on your name, and it will be sent to Adobe Analytics because it was the text that was on the link, and account numbers were also links. So it's more of an accidental thing that happens, and no one was aware of because they didn't set it up. It was just there when they got there.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in, so we're going to go into fast mode, Maggie. So I'm going to have you respond quickly. So one person just wanted to verify the data audit tool you mentioned was, and someone put a URL, datatrue.com/free-tag-audit tool. Is that the one that you use?
Oh yes, I was just trying to go back to that slide to show you the URL, but I think you have to Google this.
Yep, they put it. Yeah, someone responded.
Oh,
so
okay.
I'm going to copy that and just put that in the chat as you answer the next question.
Perfect.
Next one. Are there any good resources out there for doing automated testing if a developer doesn't have experience with automated testing of tags?
Yeah, I think DataTrue and ObservePoint are the best places where you can start because they're already built for all of these scenarios that are analytics specific. Sorry, I'm just going crazy with the slides now.
Okay, next one. Okay, next one. Is the container lingo specific to GTM? What's the Adobe equivalent?
Adobe Launch also has containers that you release. So it's just a script that includes all of your tags. That's what I mean by container. So both Adobe and Google have them.
Okay. Next question. How do you split the genuine network calls from a partner versus piggybacking? For a lot of tags genuinely call multiple partners like a DSP. Any tips on that?
Yes, this is where you just really need to be aware and make an inventory of the things that you do expect and the things that you don't expect. Yeah, you can whitelist in your test the ones that you are expecting. It may be okay to send the name to like your own company server, for example, if somebody's filling out a form, but not if it's shared with the retargeting tag.
Okay. Next question. I see the event-driven data layer as the future, but I receive a lot of resistance from the development teams. Any recommendations on how to get developers on board?
Yeah, influencing others, it's actually the hardest thing in the analytics practice, I will say. And you know, it really comes down to like a classic negotiation where you have to look at what they want, what you want, and how to make those two things intercept and present it in a way that they also see the value in it. So yeah, I think that's not necessarily like a technical analytics thing, but you're going to have to develop like a whole negotiating skill there.
Yeah, and I've always found that it makes your implementation less fragile so that you have less cases where things break and you don't, then there's periods of time where you don't have data when things break, when they make a change. So One other question, who normally implements the data layer, the web application team or the analytics team?
In my case, it was the web analytics team that was taking care of the data layer, but I was writing down the requirements for them and doing the user testing, the approvals after they have done it.
Got it. So if you, so Jose followed up with his earlier question about the campaign URLs, and what he showed is an example of someone putting website.com and then they put campaign one in the UTM and then a question mark, and then they put another UTM campaign number two. So I think he was trying to figure out how do you make sure that you don't have issues if people are copying a URL and then throwing a campaign URL at the end of it, but they don't realize that there's actually already a campaign URL. I don't know that there's that much you can do about that, but do you have any, have you ever run into that or figured out a way to kind of QA that?
Yeah, so I had to write a lot of custom code to try and strip out my UTM campaign parameters and clean them as much as possible before sending them to my reports. That is pretty painful. What I will recommend is that you talk to the people who are creating these links and you try to make it as easy, as fail proof as possible for them to add these links to their campaigns. In my case, what that meant was that I had to create in the CRM where the marketers were generating these campaign links, I had to create a custom add-on that will just automatically generate the links for them and will allow them to test them right there, make sure they were working. And once we have made sure that the landing page was tracked properly, then they will be able to use it.
Yeah, and there are tools out there that also automate this and make it so that it's a little more rigid. Claravine is the one that I use the most, and it will basically create these for you and just give your stakeholders the URLs they're supposed to use, which takes a lot of the human error out of the process. So next question is more of a generic one. I'm not sure, but I'm sure you have an opinion on it. How do you get buy-in from stakeholders for better budgets to digital implementations? So a little bit tangent from our topic, but curious for your opinion.
Yeah, so I think it's related to the negotiation piece and showing value of what you're bringing to the table. And I will also just say that you shouldn't give up if you fail to influence somebody the first time. You should continue trying, and it's just like an A/B test. You can try like presentation number one or page number two and just keep going. Eventually you will find the way. Don't give up.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times persistence pays off. So you may have covered this, but someone went back to the piggybacking and said, what's the impact of piggybacking tags?
So the impact is that if you are in an area where legislation is very rigid and you didn't disclose that you were sharing information with Adroll, like in our example, you could get penalized. I mean, the enforcement of all of these laws is not as strong as it could be, I guess. But I guess the whole topic of this presentation is just preparing for the worst. And you definitely don't want to end up in a court just because you forgot to add a line item in your policy page that says, oh, and we shared your information with Adderall. That's something really simple you can do. So yeah, just the risk with piggybacking is information going to places it should not be going.
Yeah, and one of our members actually just chimed in saying also they could break or slow down your site. So that's another reason. So cool. Well, I think we made it through most of the questions. So Maggie, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insights. And thanks everyone for joining. But Maggie, it's great having people like you from the community to come in and share your expertise. So thank you once again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Adam. And I love the community and the content that you guys are putting together.
Awesome. Okay, well, everyone have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you at the next webinar. There is a cool one coming up in the next couple weeks in the tag management area. Simo Ahava is going to enlighten us on server-side tagging. So that's one you definitely don't want to miss. So look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thanks.